All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Some others may join us, but again, feel free to share. We have a relatively small group. We had about 15 or so sign up. So that being said, there may be times that I ask you to unmute and share. Otherwise, we also have a chat feature, and I'll be opening this up at various times for you to respond, okay? And then did everybody receive in their confirmation email, they should have received a link to a document that we're going to be using, a shared Google document. Did everybody receive that?
Yes, I did.
Okay, Summer, you have it. When we get to that slide and I open it, if anyone has trouble finding it, I can cut and paste and stick it into the chat feature, okay? But I wanted us to have a place where we could share ideas, and then you'll have access to that document after today. Okay, so welcome. My name is Michelle Regan. I'm a director here at Inspired Instruction in New Jersey. We're a professional development company that works with schools across the tri-state area, down into Maryland and DC. And we're also starting to do a lot more virtual work. We were starting prior to this, but then this obviously the current situation presented an even greater need. So for those of you who are out of state, feel free to chat with me afterwards and we can talk about what that looks like, okay? But as we get started today to talk about making the most of the summer, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you have a lot of background noise, feel free to mute. Otherwise, you can stay unmuted. And again, I will be opening and closing the chat feature throughout. Right now, I'm gonna close it down. And what else do I want to share with you? So my background is I'm a special educator for, I like to say 20 plus years. I don't like to put an actual number on it. But I think a lot of what's going on in our system right now, the evolution of how quickly education is changing is, I think, really, really important for us. And I'm so excited you're here today because especially as a special educator, I know things are changing all the time, but for the entire education system to literally be flipped on its head in a very short period of time, I think it's really important that educators come together and share ideas and learn how we can be effective. Okay, so as we get started, your takeaways, this is what I hope you will leave with, is really what's working in your present at-home learning situation, what areas need improvement. And when I say that, I don't just mean about virtual learning, but how can we take what we've learned and move it for fall, okay? Take those learnings and apply them. And then what are the specific areas we should be focusing on over the summer and beyond as we make a plan for what's gonna happen next, okay? And I'm not sure if any of you have read any of the research, but probably about maybe late March, some research came out talking about the COVID slide. What is the COVID slide? The idea here was really about the summer slide. What we know students tend to have happen over the summer is there tends to be some regression, but they're basically saying that due to what's happened and that we've moved to virtual learning or at-home learning so quickly before we knew if resources were really in place for every student, that slide is going to be much greater. And so we want to really leverage this opportunity in the summer to decrease that slide, to decrease that regression. Okay, so there's more information about the COVID slide. If you're interested, we can talk at the end during the Q&A section. Okay, so we're gonna get started with 3 sets of questions I want you to think about. And as we go through this, I'm going to pull up our reflection and evaluation sheet to think about them first, and then I'll pull up that document and you all can pull up the document on your end, okay? But first we want to consider what has been working. And I really want you to consider, if you're a teacher or an administrator, okay, what were the specific routines and structures that were effective for you? Okay, I'm going to pull up the document in a minute, but right now I want you to just start thinking. What were the types of lessons and activities that were most successful with your students? I'm sure that teachers tried some things that maybe flopped, or maybe it didn't work the first time, but it worked when they tried it again 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, as people became accustomed to this learning platform. So we want to think about what really worked, okay? And then also we want to look at this social emotional piece and consider what were the ways that you felt you were able to provide that kind of support or that kind of instruction to students. Because clearly going forward, we're going to need to build in a social emotional piece, probably like we never have before. Okay, so let me pull up that document. And again, if you're struggling to find the link that I sent you, I'm going to go ahead and put this, I'm going to cut and paste this and add it to the chat feature. So just bear with me as I do that. Just in case someone's, whoops, in case someone is unable to find it, okay? So what I thought would be nice is that we can each go into the sections and just add ideas. I'm not expecting full sentences, but if you just want to go in and jot down an idea in any of these top 3 areas, so the specific routines and structures, the specific lessons and activities, or how you were able to provide emotional support. What I thought we would do is we're going to spend about 3 to 4 minutes in each of the areas, just as a place to compile ideas. Okay, and I'm going to do it as well. I see quite a few of you are in here, so that's great. And I'm just going to give us some minutes, a few minutes to be, working on this, and then I'm going to ask for some discussion. Okay, so feel free to just go in and if you'd like to put your initials next to it, you can. You don't have to, because again, it's just really a compilation of ideas. As you guys are writing, I'm going to just make some mental notes so that we can start our discussion, and I may ask you to elaborate a little bit. So if that's the case, if you wouldn't mind when we get to that point, just unmuting so that we can share a little bit. Oh, I love that. Okay, so I'm going to just do a little summary and then I'm going to ask you all to share. So first and foremost, what I'm noticing is some of the things that you consider a routine or a structure would actually also, I'm going to steal this, LB, Leslie, you put some things here, I'm going to steal this. Okay, that's okay. Leslie was sharing that they did packets and not virtual, and that's totally okay, and we'll talk more about that. But what I wanted to share was things that you put down as a routine or a structure, and I added one in here as well. Interestingly enough, those can also provide social and emotional support, because since this platform was so new and people didn't know what to expect, if a student knew, oh, every Monday morning, I'm going to have this particular thing happen, or someone put that they post it every morning, they know for Miss So-and-so, I look in my Google Classroom every morning. That idea of a routine and having some consistency is really important for students. So that's something I think was a big takeaway as we supported school districts as they were engaging in rolling out virtual learning, is it was really important to put in place these routines and structures. I have two high schoolers, and both very different learning styles, but both strong and want to achieve. And they found it very frustrating to have teachers randomly post at random times. You know, the school day was supposedly over at 3 o'clock, but then the things would be posted at 5 o'clock and they would miss those assignments. And again, it's not a judgment because this is a new platform for everyone. We're learning. However, just I think a big takeaway from this is how important those routines and structures are. Okay. Anyone want to comment on anything that they see here regarding, you know, the ability to put those routines and structures in place? Feel free to unmute. Anyone? Jenny, can I call on you since I know that you're you're here? I'm not sure if you're
I'm here.
at the moment. Anything jump out at you?
From the routines.
Yay!
Which I have my 6-year-old next to me, so I apologize. I think a lot of that perspective is really looking at what they used to support her because of her age level, and also she's got an IEP. So I think at this age level, the burden really did fall on the teacher. And just like you mentioned, her teacher is very consistent. So everything was posted right at 8 a.m.
Okay.
Google. So I like Google Classroom and Google Meets. It's been very effective, but I'm also very fluent at it.
Right.
And I know that I hit a lot of frustrations as a parent, just with focus and concentration. So I can't even imagine what it would be like for a working parent in this structure, because working with our more severe population of students that are severely cognitively impaired that do 2.5-hour Zoom instruction, those students, a lot of them have dropped off. And keeping parents engaged has been a challenge. And we've been doing paper packets, mailing out packets and materials, flexible scheduling, and doing Zoom. And it's been a challenge.
So I'm really glad that you mentioned that, Jenny, and I'm going to add to this list any routines and structures that we create that we think, wow, these are super awesome. This is going to help me be organized as a teacher, organized as an administrator. We also want to be mindful that they may or may not work for our students and our students' families. Okay, so that being said, we had, and we're going to talk about this as we go a little bit further, really talking to schools about how are we emphasizing grading? How are we looking at assessment versus grading? Because, for example, in my students' school district, they did less face-to-face instruction than I would have hoped. But what I had found out was that there were many parents who had said, because I'm a working parent, I'm not going to be there to support, you know, my child can't attend this time. And so there has to be that flexibility. And I see, Julie, you're shaking your head as an administrator. If you found similar things happen, so there needs to be some flexibility so that we're not penalizing kids for situations that may or may not be in their control. Anyone want to add to that, Julie or anybody else, about how these routines and structures could be really great, but there's also some obstacles or some drawbacks?
One of our biggest struggles was getting kids onto the weekly Zoom meetings because we are largely agricultural community. And so our farmer and rancher parents took advantage of having students home, my own kids included in that. So for them, we had to be flexible with the Zoom meetings and things like that. Teachers ended up recording them and then students could watch them when it was convenient for them. So.
Absolutely. So I think you raise a point about knowing the population and knowing the demographics. But even if we do think we know, there's still going to be things that come up. And, you know, in my district, like I mentioned, I was very surprised to learn that so many, that there were so many conflicts. But to your point, let's problem solve, let's troubleshoot. And so a great one is to record them, like you mentioned. So that's a really important piece. But I hope that this document can be helpful as we move forward, because we don't know if we're going to have to do virtual again. We don't know if we're going to start the year with virtual. We don't know if we're going to go back full-time face-to-face, but then something may come up in October or November. So some of these things, I think these shared ideas can be really helpful. And so I'm just going to add the one that we talked about, is be flexible with routines and provide alternatives. Okay. All right, so we'll just kind of wrap up a little bit so we can move on to the next set of questions. But in terms of the types of things that were successful, activities, lessons, I see a lot of reference to various online resources, which is great. If your district offers these for free to the families. And the one thing I will mention is I really encouraged teachers to do a modeling and a step-by-step directions about how to use the various resources. So if kids are familiar with IXL or Reading A to Z, but their families aren't, this might be a really important piece to add, is just what does it look like? What are the step-by-step directions? Where can I find help if I'm stuck? Because the best resource, you know, might fail if parents don't know how to use it. Or if, like Jenny mentioned, her daughter is 6, if for a younger child, we can't just expect that we're gonna put the link up. You know, we're gonna have to actually go in and model. And one of the teachers we worked with, it might even have been Leslie, it might have been in your group, she said what she would do is a video modeling every new thing she added. So if she was asking the students to do some sort of reading log, she would go in, she would spend a couple minutes, and then she would model how to complete the activity. It might be a 5-minute Google Meet, and that's okay. Again, recording these things are the best option so that if someone misses it, they have the opportunity to come in and see it again. All right, let's just talk about the social emotional piece. I saw lots of great things in the school districts that we worked with and my own children's districts. And I see here some things like virtual field trips. As you know, as much as we think that they are like sort of a release for students, they're also educational. So I think building students' curiosity, lifelong learning is just as important as our standards-based education. So if you're providing opportunities for them to do a virtual field trip and kids are getting excited and maybe they have an opportunity to talk about it with their peers afterwards the next week, if you're doing it on Fridays, or do a little journaling about it, what a super way to get them excited about something that they can then put into practice and share with their peers or with their teacher after the fact. Okay. Any other thoughts about what worked? I wanted to make sure I spent time on that before we move into the areas for improvement. Okay, so let's look at what didn't work. And what I'm going to ask us to do here is, because we're limited on time, just put a little blurb or a little bullet point for you to think back on, okay? Because I want to make sure that we hit all the areas. So what routines and structures were not as successful? What lessons and activities were not as effective? So I've heard from many teachers that maybe group lessons, trying to do something with a large group of 20 students, may not have been as effective. Students were less likely to engage. And that might just be their experience, but that's just an example. What we want to consider, were there specific standards or skills that were left unaddressed? Okay. And then lastly, are there specific groups of students that had difficulty with this format? And so you mentioned students with special needs, and this may have been true for virtual, but I know, Leslie, you mentioned that you all provided packets. That may also have been difficult for students because it's less engaging, right? And we're asking students to just work with paper pencil for their entire learning experience. So that could be equally as frustrating. Oh, and some parents didn't pick up packets. So, you know, there are going to be certain structural pieces that we want to really think through for September. If there's a chance that students are going to have to be learning from home again in the fall, how do we want to ensure that every child has access to materials? So that's a great point, Leslie, and I'm glad you raised it. Okay, so I'm going to give you a minute to just jot down, and remember, you have access to this afterwards. And so what I'm going to recommend is after today, after this webinar, you should go in and go up here and make a copy of this. Okay, and once you make a copy and you name it whatever you like, then it can be shared. You can share it with other people in your own district, other teachers, that type of thing. But I would just ask not to share this document unless you copy it first, okay? Because this way each person can leave and have their own set of things to think about. Okay, so I see certain units maybe weren't addressed because it was new material, and I've also heard that from teachers that anytime that they were approaching new material, it was very, a lot of thought and consideration had to go into how might I teach this brand new material that kids had no prior experience with. Okay. All right, I'm gonna let you finish that up, and then I'm gonna move us into what's next. Okay, just gonna continue to write. And again, please feel free to revisit this after. In terms of what's next and looking at the school year, we want to look at what specific curriculum modifications might we need to consider. If there were areas that were not addressed, and we're going to talk about this in more detail, how do we want to go about adding that to our instruction? Do we actually want to make modifications in the curriculum to identify that this wasn't touched? So even though this is now a 4th grade class, these 3rd grade standards were not addressed, or a high school US 2, US History 2 teacher may need to really know that these US 1 standards were missed. Okay, so that's really important. This idea of vertical alignment, it's really what I just mentioned, is having teachers discuss, if I was in 8th grade and what's it gonna look like in 9th? We want them to talk across grade levels to really consider not only the progression of the standards, but what may have been missed or needs to be readdressed. Okay. The next thing I want to have us think about is that interventions, I think, is going to be an important focus for going forward. I just want to open the chat and see what Leslie shared. Okay, so you also are talking about specific units that were addressed, but others, especially for the parents that didn't pick them up, were unable to view them. Okay, so really thinking about interventions that might need to be in place. And when I talk about specific groups of students, the first group of students that I'm thinking about is actually what Leslie just said. Are you able to identify those students that really did not engage in at-home learning, whether that was virtual or paper packets? Okay, so that's a really important piece that we consider first and foremost, even before we think about our English language learners or our special education students or students that had limited access to internet, for example. Okay, so that's really going to be a critical piece. And that's true whether you're a teacher or an administrator. Okay, and then lastly, that social emotional support. We want to think about that in a very systematic way as we move forward. Okay, so I know we could spend our entire time on this document, but again, please make sure you come back and revisit and then share as you will within your own district. I just want to make sure that I'm getting to the rest of the topics we want to talk about. Okay, so I'm just going to come back to the PowerPoint. And again, like I mentioned, you can come back to the shared document. Okay, so we talked about these 3 areas, and we're really using these questions as a starting place. You may have additional questions that you think are really critical. What you'll notice is missing from here is we are not focusing on, for example, safe operations of how to reopen the building. We're not really focused on that because we want to just kind of drill down to the specifics. What can I do over the summer to be ready for September no matter what it looks like? Okay, so whether that's virtual, whether that's a hybrid, whether that's face-to-face, we want to be prepared no matter what our actual situation is in September. So how do we do that? We picked 5 areas that we thought would be really important for you to consider whether you're a teacher or an administrator, okay? And I'll just go through these fairly quickly and then we'll get into a little bit more detail. You can see that end of the year review or evaluation is really critical. So as a teacher, I want to make sure that whether or not grades were entered for various things, my students, my own kids in high school, they are not doing final exams this year. There were other grades that they opted not to use. So that being said, what is being produced? Are there really strong anecdotal notes, right? So we want to talk about that. We want to talk about end of year evaluation of whatever learning platform you used. So if you used Google, if you did paper packets, you want to be able to provide specific information to your administrator, and the administrator wants to reach out to the teachers to say these same questions: what worked, what didn't work. Okay. We want to look at providing resources for our students over the summer. Okay, some districts have chosen to actually do some sort of summer school. In Tennessee, they just put together a plan for offering small group and one-on-one tutoring in a socially distanced format. So your district might be considering a specific format, or they may not. But what we really want to think about is whatever resources we provide to students, are they quality resources? Okay. We want to think about resources for teachers to extend their professional learning to use these next 2 months to really make sure we're ready for September. And then we want to look at these 4 areas to plan our year next year. Okay, so let's look at these in a little more detail. I just mentioned this idea of how are we going to produce some end of year data about our students? So again, I know everybody's situation is different, but think about what information can be shared with your administrators and next year's teachers, right? So I want my next year's teachers for my son to know that the virtual format didn't really fit his learning style. He did the best he could. So you want to consider things about how frequently students participated, their own social emotional well-being. If you know kids went through particular trauma, you want to make sure that your administrators know that. Like people were mentioning before, if there were specific standards that were missed or learning gaps, that should really be addressed. Okay, in any of your notes, whatever that format is, that you're able to share that. Okay, so I see someone mentioned they created a Google Doc that teachers could put in the standards that were not taught. So that's a great start, because we really need to make sure that we don't just go ahead and start the next year without addressing those. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Okay, for end of the year platform, we want to consider the benefits and the limitations. So I've heard some people say that for students that are shy or quiet, this virtual platform was really a great way for them, because they're much more likely to communicate in writing via discussion boards and things like that. So you want to put together a list of those benefits and limitations. You also want to identify very specific professional learning needs that you might have. So if you say, you know what, I did the best I could, but I'm really not familiar with the Google apps, I only used Google Docs, then identify that for your administrators. Okay, and then specifically, how could you streamline it? So for example, I just mentioned before about, if you were posting things at all different times, or maybe even the administration could come back and say to teachers, hey, we want to require at least 2 times a week that's a face-to-face. We want to think about that, because again, if we need to do this again, we want to have these procedures in place. In my own children's district, we found it was very different teacher to teacher. And I think that could potentially cause problems going forward, because we want to make sure that everybody has, a consistent experience. Okay. And Jenny just shared that their school works with more severely impaired students, and they mailed packets every 2 weeks and had the one-on-one sessions. So you were basically presenting a menu of opportunities for people to take advantage of, which is great. Does anyone have any questions before I continue to move on? Because I can see that we're getting close to our time, but I want to make sure I address any specific questions you have. come to those during the Q&A if there's nothing that comes up now. Okay, for those standards-based resources, in our partnership with various schools, I have to say that the consistency of what was being provided to students was it varied greatly. And so I think, you know, all resources are not created equal. So I think it's very important that teachers and administrators are vetting all the resources that they use. And also, in addition to them being high quality and standards aligned, that they're focusing, you know, over the summer, we want to really make sure we're identifying resources for students that focus on things that were not addressed. So any of that unfinished learning is where we want to place emphasis. Okay, you can see this is an example of a learning menu of our lessons, and it's set out to have all of the standards identified, and it's working in a progression. Okay. In terms of professional learning, what we've identified is we've spent some time thinking about what might make sense, and we've been hearing from a lot of our partners in terms of where they should put their time and energy over the summer before they're ready for fall. And so if you take a look at these 6 areas, I don't know if something jumps out at you right away. Feel free to share, but I think we are going to see be in these areas. Did anyone want to comment on where they feel their school or their own personally, you know, their own personal learning is going to need to spend some time? And it might be that you're thinking, well, I need support in all of these areas. And while that may be true, I'm just going to a little piece of advice is I would really encourage you to focus on 1 or 2 areas. We can't spend our time trying to learn 5 or 6 new things. We wouldn't put it into practice. So whatever area you decide you want to focus on as a teacher or as a school leader, I would say pick 1 or 2 and have very specific action steps that you want to take place. So if you decide, you know what, we've never done any work around trauma sensitive practices, then you may want to provide some things for teachers to read. You may want to provide some actual PD, some training, and then you want to set up some action steps for what is that going to look like in our district, or what is that going to look like in my own personal practice. Okay. Okay, starting for September, let's look at these 4 areas. School culture, we really want to make sure that any of our instructional routines and our instructional practices align with having a strong school culture that really is going to have to deal with trauma. And I'm going to just mention that typically when I go in and do these workshops around trauma, people will call us in for very specific reasons. Perhaps there's a high population of students that have parents that are in prison. I had a school that called me for that purpose. I had some other specific reasons. I think we have to understand that at this point in time, because of what we just went through with COVID, and especially now with the protests and things like that, we can't assume to know who's experienced trauma. Okay, we have to assume that all students have had some level of trauma during this time. Okay, so you want to consider these 4 items when we're talking about our school culture. And my recommendation is really don't wait till October to start some new routine. Plan that whatever you're going to begin, it begins on day 1. You know, yes, we're going to have to debrief what we just experienced, but let's not do that as a one-time thing. Let's consider how do we put this into practice as a routine over time, starting right away. Okay. When we're looking at our curriculum, this is an example of a vertical articulation document that one of our expert consultants created. And I think what's really nice is what she wanted to do is set up not only what are the standards in a specific grade level, but what are the prerequisites to that. And so it's a really nice way to have that conversation with if you're a 3rd grade teacher, with that 2nd grade teacher, right? Because I want to know, did my kids hit 2 OA C point 4, excuse me. okay? And then as we talk about instruction, we want to consider how are we going to take those standards that were missed and embed them, okay? We'll get to that in a moment. We want to consider assessment and how it might look different going forward. I think the fact that we did not do standardized tests this year is going to force us to think about what types of benchmarks or early baseline assessments can be given early on when kids come back. It doesn't have to look like what your state assessment looked like, but I think it's really important if we're going to be ready to plan for differentiation and to create those interventions, then we're going to need to do something to say, if you look at this example, you know, here are the standards, and you might not want to do all of the standards, but here are some of these standards, and here's where the student fell, okay? These color blocks can help me put together my groups, right? So that's really important. And again, keeping in mind, how actively engaged were the students? If I had a student that showed up for everything and did every single packet, did every single activity, I don't want them to have to repeat work. I want to be able to enrich them and move them to the appropriate place that they need to be. Okay. And then lastly, when we're looking at instruction, what I just mentioned prior was about how do we embed those missed standards. A recommendation that we have here is really to not think about going back and doing like a beginning of the year review. Instead, we really want to consider how can we take the appropriate standard and embed it where it best fits across the year, okay? So, you know, you want to really take a hard look at what was missed, look at my curriculum, and see where it's going to fit, okay? You also want to consider kids are going to need lots of extra opportunities for application. So, am I doing enough guided practice? Do I have small groups or stations or centers where kids can really practice with certain skills that maybe they didn't get enough experience with prior? Can we make sure that our homework is very targeted, okay? And then lastly, this idea that we want to make sure that differentiation is, for me, it's going to be my mantra going forward. And the best way to do that is formative assessment, right? So when I think about assessment a little differently this year, I think I'm going to be placing a lot more emphasis on that formative assessment and what information I can get to make instructional decisions immediately, and less focus on that formal benchmark that happens, you know, at the end of November and mid-February and those types of things. A final note, at the start of this, I meant to mention, but if anyone in the New York area has been watching, Governor Cuomo does his daily briefs. And one of the things he says that I absolutely love is he calls it building it back better, right? We don't want to go back to what we had before. There's no need for us to reproduce a lot of the inequity that already existed, okay? So we want to think about going forward in any of the areas that I mentioned, culture, curriculum, instruction, assessment, how can we level the playing field? How can we set kids up for success? So this is going to be true wherever you are, all right? We want to really take a hard look at this idea of equity, and we'll be discussing this more in future webinars and in future blogs. So I'll be sharing after today. What I'd like to do is I will reach out to each person individually to see what additional resources you're most interested in, and then this way you can let us know if you're interested in learning more about this. Okay, I know I went over time a little bit, so I want to leave us some time for our Q&A. So any questions at all that you have, please, if you need further elaboration on something, because I did go through it fairly quickly, please unmute and you can ask it now. The other thing you might want to consider is there one takeaway that you had from today that you're going to go ahead and try right away, or you're going to spend some more time thinking about or considering? I'd love to hear that as well. All right, I might call on people. Is there anything as a teacher, if you were here today as a teacher, is there anything that you feel like, yes, I need to place more emphasis on this, or I'd like to learn more about this? Anything at all? How about our administrators? Anybody that's an administrator feel like they want to unmute and share a little bit about a takeaway for them or a question?
I will unmute myself. Again, everybody's going to get tired of listening to me, but I think that one of my biggest takeaways is how important it is to have a really solid like routine in place where it's very predictable, so that if I have to teach in person, I'm going to still follow this schedule. And if I have to go virtually, I'm going to follow this schedule, so that no matter what, it's going to be consistent, whether it's in person, whether it's virtually. And I think that's just more comforting for students. And it's also comforting for the teacher and for a parent.
I think that's a good point. And because we don't know exactly what things are going to look like in September, I think if you have that mindset, then you don't have to feel like you're creating two different platforms of learning, right? You can say, I always want to start with a do now, no matter what. I always want to make sure I'm doing this type of activity, you know, at the end of the week, right? And so I think that's really important, because it's going to help us not stress out the whole summer, you know, long until we find out. And like you said, it's also going to set kids up for success. Okay, I see somebody wrote, I'm going to ask my staff what they feel they need more experience with. I think that's huge. I think any teacher who has gone through this experience probably is exhausted, just like the administrators. But I think just having their voice heard is really important. So if somebody says, yes, I need more PD with this, or hey, how about no PD at all for the first 6 weeks and talk to me at the end of July, right? Because we also want to consider teacher and administrators' well-being, right? I mean, we're all going to need a break, and rightly so. So there has to be a balance, okay? Okay, you mentioned, Ms. Gates, you're paying your teachers to become Google certified, right? So again, any way you can take an opportunity to use this time and to use it well, even if you offer PD to teachers and say to them that it's optional, right? So they can sign up if they want to, or they don't have to. Great. I hope that this today, a little bit of area to consider for a focus for September, and how to best use the summer. If you have additional questions, I'm happy to reach out. I mean, I'm going to send everybody a follow-up little survey, and you can share with me what resources you'd like more of if there's one particular area, okay? But thank you so much for attending. I appreciate you being actively engaged, and I hope that you had something that was a takeaway for you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Hope to see you again. I'm gonna see if there's more. You're welcome. Thank you, Michael. I didn't actually see you, but I'm glad you're here. Thank you. And to everybody else who joined us. This all is going to be recorded. I just thought I should have said that at the beginning. If you did want to share with additional administrators or staff, so I'll also include that in the follow-up email. Okay. Have a great day.